I still remember the exact weight of my handbag that afternoon. Not because it felt heavier. It didn't. Not really, not in any way a scale could measure. But I would spend the rest of that year understanding that somewhere between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, while I was pouring the last of the tea and pretending not to notice the wind picking up over the harbor, my family had quietly, irreversibly, stopped being what I thought it was. If you're just settling in with a cup of something warm, I want you to stay with me for this one. This isn't a story with a villain in it. There's no monster waiting in the dark. What there is something far more familiar to most of us than we'd like to admit. A house full of people who loved each other and still managed for years to get nearly everything wrong. So if that sounds like a family you recognize, even a little, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one of them, and I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why I'm asking. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 78 years old, and for 31 of those years, I worked at the Devonport Library, a job I loved with an intensity I never quite managed to explain to people who hadn't done it themselves. There is something about spending 3 decades surrounded by other people's stories that teaches you to read silences the way other people read sentences. I didn't know, that particular Sunday, that this skill was about to be tested in a way no library training course could have prepared me for. I live alone now, in a wooden villa on Church Street that has been in my husband's family since before either of us were born. Robert passed 11 years ago, and the house has settled into a particular kind of quiet since then. Not lonely exactly, just attentive, the way old houses get when they've held a lot of life and are waiting patiently for more of it. From my sunroom, if you lean just slightly to the left in the good chair, you can see a slice of the harbor between the pohutukawa trees. And on a clear evening, you can watch the ferries crossing back toward the city, their lights coming on one by one as the sky goes the color of a bruise healing. That Sunday had been, by every outward measure, an entirely ordinary one. My granddaughter Hannah had come to stay for the weekend, as she does perhaps once every 6 weeks, and we had spent it the way we always do. Saturday morning at the market down by the wharf, where she insists on buying me feijoa chutney I never asked for and always end up loving. A walk up to North Head in the afternoon, slower than it used to be, with me complaining about my hip and her pretending not to notice when I needed to stop. Dinner on Saturday night that I cooked badly and she ate generously. Church on Sunday morning, which she attends out of love for me rather than any belief of her own, and which I have long since stopped trying to change her mind about. Hannah is 31 years old now, though some part of me still expects to turn around and find her 7, sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor, sorting buttons into a tin. She works as a documentary editor, which is a profession I only half understand even after years of her trying to explain it to me. Something about stitching together other people's footage until it tells a truth the raw material couldn't tell on its own. I think, looking back now, that this should have told me something important about her. A person who spends her working life finding the hidden shape inside scattered fragments is not a person who simply stumbles into things by accident. If you're enjoying the slow unwind of this so far, I'd love it if you hit that like button right about now. It helps more than you'd think, and it lets me know you're settling in for the whole journey, because this one has a great many turns still ahead of it. And go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. There's a new story waiting here every single week, and I have a feeling, if you're the sort of person who stays for the quiet ones, you and I are going to get along just fine. It was at the door that everything changed. We had said our goodbyes the way we always do. A cup of tea pressed into her hands for the road. An instruction to text me when she got home, even though she's 31 and perfectly capable of getting herself home safely. But this time, when she hugged me, she held on. Not for an extra second. Not for an awkward, noticeable pause that might have made me ask if something was wrong. She held on for long enough that I felt, somewhere beneath my ribs, an old and very specific kind of alarm. The kind a grandmother develops not through any particular wisdom, but simply through paying close attention to the same person for 3 decades. And then, as she pulled back, she did something I didn't notice until much later. Her hand slipped briefly into my handbag, which was hanging open on the hook by the door, as it always does, and when she stepped away, there was the faintest whisper of paper against the lining that I registered only as a vague, unplaceable sound. She looked at me then, not with fear, not with anything I could have named in the moment. It was an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before, not once in 31 years, and I have struggled since to find the right word for it. Resolve, perhaps. Or relief mixed with dread, the particular look of someone who has finally decided to do something they've been avoiding for a very long time. "Please," she said very quietly, "don't open this until you're completely alone." And then she smiled. An ordinary smile, the kind she gives me every single time she leaves, said she loved me, and walked down the path toward her car as though nothing at all had happened. I stood in the doorway for a long moment after her car had disappeared around the corner of Church Street, the afternoon light doing that particular gold thing it does here in late autumn, and I felt, for reasons I could not yet articulate, that the ground beneath my ordinary Sunday had shifted very slightly on its axis. If a moment like that has ever happened to you, a hug that lasted a little too long, a sentence that didn't quite fit the moment it was spoken in, I want you to write it in the comments below. Tell me what it was, and tell me whether you ever found out what it meant. I have a feeling I'm not the only person sitting on a story like that. I didn't open my handbag in the hallway. I'm not entirely sure why. Perhaps some part of me already understood that whatever was inside deserved more ceremony than a rushed glance while balancing my keys and the leftover chutney. So I made myself another cup of tea, settled into the good chair in the sunroom, watched a ferry crawl its way across the silver water toward the city, and only then did I open my bag. Tucked beneath my purse and a half-finished crossword was a plain white envelope sealed with nothing written on the front. It was thicker than a letter ought to be, and when I turned it over in my hands, I could feel something small and rectangular shifting inside alongside what was clearly a quantity of paper. I sat with it unopened for what felt like a very long time. There is a particular fear that comes with a sealed envelope from someone you love. A fear that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the body's memory of every other moment in your life when bad news arrived in an unassuming form. I thought of Robert's diagnosis, delivered to us once in a manila folder that looked entirely too ordinary for the news it contained. I thought of my own mother, decades ago now, and the telegram that came to her kitchen table looking exactly like every other piece of mail that had ever arrived there. But this was not that. When I finally opened it, what spilled out onto my lap was not catastrophe. It was something stranger, and in its own way, far more unsettling for being so quiet. There was a handwritten letter, several pages long, in Hannah's careful, slightly slanted handwriting. There was a small flash drive, the kind you could lose in a coat pocket for a year. And there were photocopies, dozens of them it seemed, of documents whose headers I recognized only vaguely. A solicitor's letterhead from a firm in the city I hadn't seen in years. Bank correspondence with dates going back further than I expected. Some of them faded in that particular way. Old photocopies fade, soft at the edges, as if time itself had been smudging at them. There were what looked like fragments of a will. There were copies of letters written in handwriting I didn't recognize at first, and then did, with a jolt that went straight through my chest. I am going to pause here, because I think you need a moment to settle the way I needed a moment to settle. Tell me right now, while it's fresh in your mind, what do you think was in those documents? I want to read your guesses in the comments because I promise you, almost none of you are going to land anywhere close to the truth. And if you're the patient sort, the sort who likes piecing together a mystery slowly rather than having it handed to you all at once, subscribe now, because this is exactly the kind of story I tell, week after week, one careful thread at a time. I read Hannah's letter twice before I could make myself look properly at the documents beneath it. I will share more of exactly what it said as we go, because I don't want to rob you of discovering it the way I did, piece by careful piece. but I can tell you this much now. It began with an apology. Not for anything dramatic, not for any wrongdoing on her part. It began simply with the words, "Nana, I have known something for 3 years that I was too afraid to tell you, and I think the not telling you has cost both of us more than the truth ever could have." 3 years. I sat very still in that chair as the light over the harbor faded from gold to gray to the deep blue of early evening, and I thought about every single conversation I'd had with my granddaughter over those 3 years, every dinner, every market morning, every walk up to North Head, where she let me set the pace and never once let on that she was carrying something this heavy beside me the entire time. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is the entire point of what I'm trying to do here. My first instinct, sitting in that chair with those documents on my lap, was not curiosity. It was a particular kind of grief, the grief of realizing that someone you love has been quietly alone with something hard, for years, within arm's reach of you, and you never noticed. If you have ever felt that particular ache, the ache of discovering you weren't told something not out of malice, but out of love and fear, I want you to know I understand it now in a way I never did before that Sunday evening. The documents themselves, once I worked up the courage to look at them properly, told a story I did not yet understand, but immediately recognized as serious. There were references to a property, not this house, but another one, older, in a part of Auckland I hadn't thought about in years. There were figures, sums of money that meant nothing to me out of context, but felt significant simply by their presence on official letterhead. There was a name I knew intimately, signed at the bottom of one particular letter in handwriting that had aged 30 years since I'd last seen it used for anything beyond a birthday card. It was my younger sister's signature, Margaret, 81 years old now, living quietly in a retirement village out toward Birkenhead, a woman I had always considered, perhaps unfairly, the simpler of the two of us. The one who never asked many questions. The one who, I realized with a sudden cold clarity sitting in my sunroom that evening, perhaps had never asked many questions precisely because she had spent decades being very carefully managed by people who preferred her not to. I am not going to tell you tonight what was in that letter from her, or what it meant, because I think some things deserve to be unwrapped slowly, the way Hannah clearly intended them to be when she chose to hand them to me one piece at a time rather than simply explaining everything in a single conversation. What I will tell you is this. By the time the light had gone fully out of the sky over the harbor, I understood that I was looking at evidence of something that had been quietly shaping my family's life for far longer than 3 years, possibly far longer than I had been alive to witness any of it directly. And I understood something else, too. Something that settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. Whatever this was, it was not finished. Hannah had not handed me an envelope full of answers. She had handed me an envelope full of a single enormous question, and the unmistakable sense underneath everything that she was trusting me specifically, out of every adult in our family, to be the one who finally asked it out loud. If you've made it this far with me, thank you. Truly. Stories like this one take patience to tell properly, and I know patience is in short supply these days. Drop a comment telling me one word for how you're feeling right now, just one word, and I'll be reading them as I keep going. And if there's someone in your life who loves a slow, thoughtful mystery the way I suspect you do, send this their way. I have a feeling this is going to be one they'll want to talk about with you once they've heard the whole thing. Because what I didn't yet know, sitting alone in my sunroom that Sunday evening with the harbor gone dark outside my window, was that the flash drive in my lap held something even harder to prepare for than the documents did. And what was on it would force me to reconsider not just my sister, but nearly every person I had loved for the better part of 50 years. I want to tell you about the flash drive properly, because I think you deserve the full shape of what that small piece of plastic did to my understanding of my own family, rather than a rushed summary of it. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to plug it into anything. I want to be honest about that, because I suspect some of you have had your own version of this experience. A piece of information sitting in a drawer, fully accessible, that you simply cannot bring yourself to look at yet. I am not a woman who frightens easily. I buried a husband. I navigated 31 years of a profession that exposed me to every variety of human difficulty that walks through a public library's doors. But there is a particular kind of fear that comes from knowing that whatever is on that drive will change the shape of your memory permanently, will reach backward and recolor every conversation you've already had, every dinner already eaten, every photograph already taken. That is a fear that has nothing to do with courage and everything to do with grief for a version of your own past you are about to lose. If you've ever delayed opening something because some part of you already understood it would change everything, tell me about it below. I promise you, by the time this story is finished, you'll understand exactly why I waited those 3 days, and you may find yourself thinking rather differently about your own hesitations. On the Wednesday, I finally borrowed my neighbor's old laptop. Mine is ancient and unreliable in the way that all my technology has slowly become since Robert, who handled such things, passed away. And I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink, and I plugged it in. There were 11 files on the drive. Video recordings, each one labeled only with a date. The earliest from just over 3 years prior, the most recent from only 6 weeks before that Sunday at my door. Hannah, it became clear within the first 30 seconds of the first recording, had been speaking to herself, not performing for an audience, not crafting anything for public consumption. These were the private recordings of a young woman trying to think her way through something too large and too tangled to hold entirely in her own head, the way some people keep a journal and others, apparently, keep a camera. In the first recording, she looked younger than I expected, though it had only been 3 years. She was sitting in what I recognized as her own flat, the light behind her, the particular flat gray of an Auckland afternoon in early winter, and she began simply by saying, "I don't know who this is for yet. Maybe just me. Maybe someday Nana. I don't know." And then she began to explain what she had found. I will tell you, in the order I came to understand it myself, because I think the order matters as much as the content. The first thing Hannah had discovered, 3 years earlier, while helping our cousin's husband sort through decades of paperwork after a house move, was a property deed for an address she didn't recognize, dated from 1987, with my sister Margaret's name on it as sole owner. A property neither I, nor as far as Hannah could tell, anyone else currently living had ever heard mentioned in 37 years. This alone might have meant nothing. People buy and sell property across a lifetime, and not every transaction gets discussed at the dinner table. But what struck Hannah, and what struck me with considerably more force once I understood it myself, was the date. 1987 was the year, as anyone in our family who lived through it could tell you without needing reminding, that our older brother Desmond had what was, at the time, quietly and somewhat shamefully referred to within the family as his difficulty. I won't pretend to you tonight that I fully understood even then what that difficulty actually was. I was 39 years old, raising 2 children of my own, and the adults of that generation had a particular gift for managing crisis through omission, for protecting each other from painful knowledge by simply declining to share it. If your own family has ever had a year like that, a year everyone remembers with a kind of careful vagueness, a year nobody quite explains the same way twice, I want you to sit with that feeling for a moment, because it's going to matter quite a lot to where this story goes. Subscribe now if you haven't, because I promise you, the way these pieces eventually fit together is not what you're expecting, and I would hate for you to miss it. Hannah's second recording, filmed perhaps 4 months after the first, showed her sitting in what I now recognized as our family solicitor's old waiting room, holding her phone at an angle clearly meant to be discreet. She had gone, she explained quietly to the camera, to ask some careful, indirect questions, framing her curiosity as simple family history research, the kind of thing young people do these days with genealogy websites and old certificates. The solicitor's assistant, a woman who had apparently known our family for decades, had let slip almost in passing that there had been an arrangement involving Margaret's property and Desmond's circumstances back in '87. An arrangement that had been, in her words, handled very quietly, the way families used to handle things. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the laptop's small fan humming in the silence of my own kitchen, and feeling something shift in my chest that I can only describe as the particular vertigo of realizing the floor of your own history has a trapdoor in it you never knew was there. Because here is what I had always believed, what I had told myself for 37 years without a single doubt crossing my mind. I had always believed that Desmond's recovery during that difficult period, his sudden and somewhat unexplained financial stability after what had been, by every appearance, a genuinely desperate season of his life, had come from our late father's modest inheritance, distributed slightly early due to circumstances none of us discussed in detail. I had believed this not because anyone had ever explicitly told me so, but because it was the explanation that required asking the fewest questions. And our family, I am only now coming to understand at the age of 78, had an entire architecture built around requiring the fewest possible questions. What the documents in that envelope suggested, and what Hannah's careful 3 years of quiet investigation seemed to confirm piece by piece across those 11 recordings, was something else entirely. It suggested that Margaret, then a woman of only 31 herself, the very same age Hannah is now, a coincidence that still catches in my throat every time I think of it, had quietly sold a property she had never once mentioned owning, and had used the proceeds to help our brother in a manner that none of the rest of us had ever been told about, in exchange for an agreement that has shaped, in ways I am only now beginning to fully grasp, the entire subsequent financial architecture of our family for nearly 4 decades. I am going to pause again here, because I know how much I'm asking of your patience, and I want you to know I see that, and I'm grateful for it. If you're the sort of viewer who likes connecting threads slowly rather than racing to the end, comment the word patient below right now, just so I know you and I think alike. And give this a like if this story has you leaning forward the way it had me leaning forward over that little borrowed laptop at my own kitchen table. What troubled me most, watching those recordings unfold across that Wednesday evening and well into the night, was not the financial arrangement itself. Families help each other. Families make sacrifices, quietly, generously, and the world rarely needs to know the precise mechanics of how love moved money from one set of hands to another. What troubled me was the silence that had been built around it, a silence so complete and so carefully maintained that 37 years later, an 81-year-old woman living quietly in a retirement village had apparently never once been thanked by anyone outside that original arrangement for what she had given up. And there was something else in Hannah's recordings, something that took me until nearly the 9th file to fully understand, something that explained, finally, why she had carried this alone for 3 years rather than simply bringing it to me the moment she found the first document. She was afraid, she said quietly into the camera during that 9th recording, her voice catching in a way I had genuinely never heard from my granddaughter in her entire life, that if she told the family what she'd found, it would not be received as the discovery of an old, generous sacrifice deserving of gratitude. She was afraid it would be received as an accusation. She was afraid that Desmond, now 76 and not entirely well, would feel exposed in a way he could not bear at this stage of his life. She was afraid that Margaret, who had clearly chosen silence for her own private reasons across nearly 4 decades, might feel that silence violated rather than honored. And she was afraid, most of all, in a confession that genuinely brought tears to my eyes, sitting alone at that kitchen table, that I specifically, her Nana, the person she trusted more completely than anyone else in her life, might somehow be hurt by learning that an entire chapter of our shared family history had unfolded so completely without my knowledge, despite my being, in every other respect, The person everyone in this family has always come to when something needed sorting out. "I didn't want you to feel like the only person who never knew," she said near the very end of that 9th recording, looking directly into the camera in a way that felt, watching it 3 years later, almost like she was looking directly at me. But I also couldn't keep being the only person who did. If you've ever carried a secret out of love rather than malice, out of protection rather than deception, I want you to know that this story understands you completely, and so do I. Comment below if you've ever been in Hannah's position, caught between two kinds of loyalty that should never have had to compete with each other in the first place. And if you have someone in your life who you suspect might be carrying something like this right now, something heavy and silent and entirely well-intentioned, I want you to think about sending them this story tonight. Sometimes the gentlest way to open a door is to simply show someone it's already slightly open. I did not sleep much that Wednesday night. I sat with the documents spread across my kitchen table in the lamplight, the harbor invisible beyond my dark window, and I made a decision that I want to tell you about properly, because I think it's the decision that everything else in this story eventually grew from. I decided I would not confront anyone. Not yet. Not Margaret, not Desmond, not my own son, whose name, I should tell you, appeared in several of those later financial documents in a context I genuinely did not yet understand and would spend the following weeks working very hard to make sense of. I decided that whatever I did next, it could not begin with accusation, because I had just spent an entire evening learning, in the most painful way possible, exactly how much damage a family does to itself when its members decide that protecting each other means deciding for each other what they're allowed to know. What I decided to do instead, sitting at that table as the first gray edge of Thursday morning crept in around my curtains, was something far slower, and, I think now, far braver than confrontation would have been. I decided to find out the truth properly, carefully, the way I used to track down a half-remembered reference for a library patron who could only describe a book by the color of its cover and the year they thought they'd read it, patiently, methodically. Without assuming, before I had earned the right to assume anything, that I already understood what any of it meant. And the very first call I made, early that Thursday morning, was not to a single member of my family. It was to the local police station. Not because I believed, even for a moment, that anyone in my family had done something violent or cruel. I want to be entirely clear with you about that, because I know how easily a phrase like, "I called the police," can suggest something far more frightening than what actually happened in my case. I called because I genuinely did not know, looking at decades-old property transfers and unexplained financial arrangements involving an elderly woman who might not have fully understood the implications of what she'd signed 37 years earlier. Whether what I was looking at was a quiet act of family generosity or something that had, somewhere along the way, crossed into territory that an 81-year-old woman deserved proper protection from. The officer who eventually took my call, a calm, unhurried woman named Detective Sergeant Priya Nair, listened to my entire rambling explanation without once interrupting me, and at the end of it she said something I have thought about often since. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "it sounds to me like you found the beginning of a very old story that several people decided to stop telling. That's not always a crime, but it's always worth understanding properly, and you're right to want to do that carefully." She agreed to help me in the limited way that the law actually allows for matters that sit so delicately between family privacy and genuine concern for a vulnerable adult's welfare, by pointing me toward the Public Property Records Office, toward an elder law advocate who specializes in exactly these kinds of decades-old quiet arrangements, and toward the solicitor's firm itself, whose current partners, she gently reminded me, have an obligation to respond properly to a family member's good faith concerns about historical paperwork, particularly where an elderly relative's well-being might be involved. If you're still with me, thank you truly for your patience through all of this. We are only at the very beginning of what I learned that year, And I promise you, the deeper I went into those records, into those conversations, into the slow unwinding of nearly 40 years of careful family silence, the more this story surprised me at every single turn. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next involved a conversation with my sister Margaret that I will never, for as long as I live, stop thinking about. And I want you here with me when I tell it properly. For now, I will leave you with this. I sat in my sunroom that Thursday evening, the harbor gold again with the last of the day's light, and I held that empty envelope in my hands, the one Hannah had slipped into my handbag with such quiet, deliberate care. And I thought about how strange it was that something so small and unremarkable could hold the weight of an entire family's unspoken history inside it. I did not yet know what I would find when I finally sat across from Margaret. I did not yet know what my own son had to do with any of this, or why his name kept appearing in documents I had not yet found the courage to fully examine. I did not yet know that Desmond himself had been carrying a version of this secret that was, in its own way, even heavier than the one Hannah had carried. But I knew, sitting there with that empty envelope in my lap, that whatever this family had built its peace upon for the last 37 years, that foundation was about to be looked at properly for the very first time. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I was finally ready to be the one who looked. I want to tell you about the morning I finally went to see my sister Margaret, because I think it's the morning where this story stopped being about documents and flash drives and quietly became about something far more human than any paperwork could ever capture. Before I do, though, I want to pause for just a moment and thank everyone who's been commenting since the last part. I read every single one of them, truly, and I noticed something rather lovely. So many of you have your own version of an envelope. A box in an attic. A conversation half overheard through a wall as a child that you never quite forgot. If that's you, and you haven't told me yet, do it now while it's fresh in your mind. And if you're new here, settling in for the first time, welcome. Subscribe, because this story has a great many more turns left in it, and I'd hate for you to wander off and miss where it's going. I drove out to Birkenhead on the Friday morning, nearly a full week after Hannah had pressed that envelope into my handbag. I had rehearsed, in the way that only a woman of 78 with several decades of careful library diplomacy behind her can rehearse, exactly how I intended to open the conversation. I did not want it to sound like an accusation. I did not want it to sound like a confrontation. I wanted it, more than anything, to sound like what it actually was, which was an apology disguised as a question. Margaret's retirement village sits on a quiet rise with a view, on a clear day, all the way out across the upper harbor. She was sitting on her small balcony when I arrived, a cardigan over her shoulders despite the mild weather, the way she's done every single autumn since she turned 70, regardless of the actual temperature outside. She looked, as she always looks to me, exactly like the 11-year-old girl I once shared a bedroom with, simply wearing 81 years on top of that same face. "Eleanor," she said, in the particular tone she uses when she already suspects a visit isn't purely social. "You've got your serious face on." I sat down across from her without quite knowing how to begin, and so, in the end, I simply placed the photocopied property deed on the small table between us, the one dated 1987, her name printed clearly across the top of it, and I said nothing at all. I simply waited. I have thought a great deal, since that morning, about the particular silence that followed. It was not a long silence by the clock, perhaps 15 seconds, 20 at most. But I have rarely experienced a silence with that much weight pressed into it. Margaret looked at the document for a long moment, and then she looked up at me, and something in her face that I had genuinely never seen before, not once across 81 years of being her sister, simply gave way. "I always wondered which one of you would find it first," she said quietly. "I rather hoped it would be you. If you've ever watched someone set down a weight they've been carrying for decades, you'll understand exactly what I mean when I tell you that her shoulders actually changed shape in that moment. Not dramatically, not theatrically. Just a small, almost imperceptible settling the way an old house settles after a long winter. I want to pause here because I think this is exactly the moment to ask you something important. Have you ever had a conversation where the truth, once it finally arrived, felt less like a blow and more like relief for both people involved? Tell me about it in the comments, because I genuinely believe these are some of the most meaningful moments two human beings can share, and I don't think we talk about them nearly often enough. And while you're down there, go ahead and tap that like button, because this story is about to take you somewhere I genuinely did not expect to go myself. What Margaret told me that morning, sitting on her small balcony with the harbor stretching out pale and silver behind her, took the better part of 2 hours to unfold completely. And I am not going to rush it for you now, because I think it deserves the same patience she finally gave herself in telling it. In 1987, she explained, our brother Desmond had come to her, not to me, not to our parents, specifically to her in what she described as the most frightened state she had ever seen another adult in. He had made a series of business decisions in the years prior, decisions involving a small import company he'd started with 2 partners neither of us had ever fully trusted, and those decisions had collapsed in a manner that left him not simply in debt, but facing the very real possibility of losing his home, his marriage, and by his own account at the time, very nearly his will to continue at all. I felt my chest tighten hearing her describe that last part, because I had genuinely never known, in nearly 40 years, that our brother had once stood that close to the edge of something so dark. We had always spoken of 1987, when we spoke of it at all, as Desmond's difficult patch, a phrase so deliberately soft around its own edges that it had successfully hidden, apparently from everyone except Margaret, the actual severity of what he'd been living through. He had come to her, she explained, because she was the only person in the family who owned property entirely in her own name, a small rental cottage out toward Northcote that our late aunt had left specifically to her, separate from anything connected to our parents or to me. He had asked her, in what she described as the most humbling conversation of his entire life, whether she would consider helping him, not as a loan, because he had no realistic way of ever repaying a loan at that point, but as an outright gift in exchange for which he promised, and apparently kept that promise for the rest of his working life, to quietly support her financially in whatever way she ever needed, for as long as he lived. He didn't want anyone to know, Margaret said, looking out at the water rather than at me. Not because he was ashamed of asking me. He was ashamed of needing to ask anyone at all. And I agreed to keep it quiet, because I understood, even then, that some kinds of help only work if the person receiving them is allowed to keep their dignity completely intact. I am going to ask you something now that I asked myself sitting on that balcony, and I want you to really sit with it before you answer in the comments. Do you think silence, chosen out of genuine love and respect for someone's dignity, can still cause harm, even when the original intention behind it was entirely good? I don't think there's a simple answer to that question, and I don't think this story is going to give you one either. But I think it's worth asking, and I think the rest of what I learned that year only made the question harder, not easier. What troubled me most listening to Margaret that morning was not the original arrangement itself. I understood it. I even admired it, in a strange way. The quiet, fierce generosity of a younger sister stepping in to save her brother from the very edge of catastrophe without ever once asking him to feel small for needing it. What troubled me was what came after, the slow accumulation of decades during which that single act of generosity had apparently grown roots none of us had ever been told about. Roots that, as I would soon discover, had wound their way directly into matters far closer to my own immediate family than I had any reason to expect. Because here is the part of that conversation that genuinely stopped my breath in my chest. Margaret told me that the arrangement she'd made with Desmond in 1987 had been managed, almost from the very beginning, not by Desmond himself, who had little patience or aptitude for financial paperwork, even in the best of times, but by a young solicitor at the firm who had taken a particular, careful interest in making sure Margaret was never disadvantaged by her own generosity. That young solicitor, Margaret told me, watching my face very carefully as she said it, had been my own son. If you need a moment to sit with that, the way I needed a moment to sit with it, take it. I certainly did. I remember staring out at that harbor for what felt like an extraordinarily long time, turning the sentence over and over, trying to find a version of it that didn't change absolutely everything I thought I understood about my own child's relationship to the rest of this family. Before I tell you what that meant, and what it eventually led me to discover, I want to ask you to do something for me. If this story has surprised you even once so far, even in a small way, leave a comment telling me which moment it was. I love knowing exactly where a story catches people off guard, because it tells me something true about how we all carry our own assumptions into someone else's family without even realizing we're doing it. And if you know someone who'd appreciate a story that takes its time getting somewhere worth arriving at, this is exactly the moment to send it their way. My son, Andrew, was 26 years old in 1987, freshly qualified, working at what was at the time a small but respected firm in the city, the very same firm whose letterhead I'd seen scattered across those photocopied documents in my sunroom that first Sunday evening. I had known, vaguely, in the unfocused way a mother knows the general shape of her adult child's early career, that he had done some work that year for extended family. I had assumed, because it was the easiest thing to assume and required nothing further of me, that it was minor. A will here, a small piece of conveyancing there. The ordinary scaffolding of family life that young professionals quietly provide for their relatives without anyone making much of it. What I had not known, what Margaret explained to me with a gentleness that told me she had been bracing herself to say it for years, was that Andrew had not simply handled the paperwork of that original arrangement between her and Desmond. He had, in the decades since, continued to quietly manage and adjust it, restructuring it twice as tax law changed, advising both Margaret and Desmond privately, separately, on how to protect what had become, by the time of Margaret's eventual retirement, a far more significant ongoing arrangement than either of them had originally intended it to become. And he had done all of this for nearly 40 years without ever once mentioning a single detail of it to me. I felt, sitting on that balcony, an emotion I genuinely struggled to name at the time, and have only fully understood since with the benefit of considerable reflection. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something closer to a particular kind of vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing that your own child has lived an entire parallel, professional and emotional relationship with members of your family, sustained carefully across decades, that you were never once invited into. If you've ever discovered that someone you raised has an entire dimension of relationships and responsibilities you knew nothing about, I want you to know I understand that feeling now in a way I never expected to at 78 years old. Tell me below if you've experienced anything like it, with a child, a sibling, anyone you thought you knew completely. I have a feeling there are more of you out there than this world generally admits to. Margaret, to her enormous credit, did not let me sit in that disorientation without context. She explained, gently but firmly, that Andrew's silence toward me had never once been about excluding me or about deceiving me, but had grown directly out of the very same instinct that had shaped the entire arrangement from its beginning. The instinct to protect Desmond's dignity by keeping the circle of knowledge as small as humanly possible. Andrew, she said, had simply inherited that instinct the way children inherit the shape of a parent's hands, without ever consciously choosing it, and had spent decades quietly absorbing the emotional cost of that inherited silence so that the rest of us never had to. "He used to ask about you, you know," Margaret said, near the end of our conversation, in a voice that had gone soft, in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. "Every single time I saw him. How's Mum doing? Is she managing all right on her own in that house? He worried about you constantly, Eleanor. He simply never let any of that worry connect to what he was doing for the rest of us, because he'd convinced himself, somewhere along the way, that the two things had to stay completely separate. I drove home that afternoon along the coast road slowly, far more slowly than the speed limit required, because I genuinely was not certain my hands were steady enough for anything faster. The harbor on my right was doing its usual late afternoon performance, silver fracturing into gold as the sun dropped, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that I had spent 31 years as a librarian helping strangers find the exact right book to make sense of whatever they were going through. And yet here I was, at 78, only just beginning to properly read my own family's story for the very first time. If you're still with me, and I have every reason to believe you are, because something tells me you're the sort of person who finishes what they start, I want to ask you for something small before we continue. Hit subscribe right now if you haven't already, because what came next, the conversation I eventually had with my own son, the conversation that finally explained Hannah's 3 years of silence in a way that brought me to genuine tears at my own kitchen table, deserves your full attention, and I don't want you to miss a single piece of it. I telephoned Andrew that same evening, the moment I got home, before I'd even taken my coat off properly. I did not lead with accusation. I had learned, sitting with Margaret that morning, exactly how much damage that particular opening move can do to a conversation that genuinely deserves better. I simply said, "I had a long talk with Aunt Margaret today. I think it's time you and I had one too." There was a silence on the other end of that call that lasted long enough for me to wonder, briefly, whether the line had simply dropped. And then my son, 63 years old now himself, a grandfather in his own right, said quietly, in a voice that sounded considerably younger than I'd heard him sound in years, "I've been waiting for this call for almost 40 years, Mum. I just never knew which direction it would come from." We agreed to meet on the Sunday, exactly 1 week after Hannah had first pressed that envelope into my handbag, and as I hung up the phone that evening, standing alone in my hallway with my coat still half on, I felt something shift in my chest that I can only describe as the particular ache of approaching a long overdue reckoning with someone you love more than almost anyone else alive, and discovering, somewhat to your own surprise, that you are not actually afraid of what's waiting on the other side of it. I want to leave you here for just a moment on the edge of that Sunday conversation, because I think you deserve a small breath before we step into it together. Tell me, while you wait, what you imagine Andrew is going to tell me. I promise you, what actually unfolded between us at my own kitchen table surprised even an old woman who thought, by 78, she'd heard every variation of family secret this world had to offer. Andrew arrived on the Sunday at exactly 11 o'clock, the same precise punctuality he's carried since he was a boy, the kind of habit that used to make me laugh, and now, I'll admit, makes my chest ache slightly with how much it still sounds like his father. He stood on my porch for a moment, before knocking, and through the sunroom window I watched him simply breathe, the way a person breathes before stepping into a room they've been avoiding for a very long time. Before I tell you what he said, I want to thank everyone who stayed with this story across 3 full parts now. That's no small thing, and I notice it every single time. If you're new to this particular chair by my window, settle in, because today's conversation is the one that finally, fully explained everything Hannah had been carrying alone for 3 years. And if this story has given you even a single moment of recognizing your own family inside it, do me a kindness and share it with someone today. Some stories are meant to travel quietly from one kitchen table to another, exactly the way this one did in mine. I made tea because I genuinely did not know what else to do with my hands, and we sat across from each other at the same table where I'd spread those photocopied documents out just over a week earlier. Andrew looked at that table for a long moment, as though he could still see the ghost of every page laid out across it. And then he said simply, "Where do you want me to start?" "Wherever it actually begins," I told him, "not wherever feels easiest." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands, and then he began. And what followed was nearly 3 hours of the most honest conversation I believe my son and I have ever had, in 63 years of knowing each other. He told me, first, about being 26 years old and terrified, sitting across a desk from Desmond, who at the time was only 34 himself, watching a grown man he'd looked up to his entire childhood come apart in front of him in a manner he had genuinely never expected to witness. He told me that drafting that first arrangement between Desmond and Margaret had felt, at the time, like the single most important piece of work he had ever done, more important than anything he would go on to do professionally in the following decades, precisely because it had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with quietly saving someone he loved from a catastrophe that could not be undone. I genuinely believed back then that keeping it from you was a kindness, he said, looking at me directly across the table in a way that told me he'd rehearsed saying this, probably for years. You just lost Dad's mother that same year. You were exhausted, Mom. Genuinely exhausted, in a way I don't think you ever let yourself admit to anyone, including yourself. I made a decision, at 26, that you didn't need one more crisis added to a year that had already taken so much out of you. I don't think I ever properly revisited that decision again. I think I just kept making it, year after year, without realizing that the reasons that made sense in 1987 had completely stopped applying by, 1995, 2000, certainly by the time you retired. If you've ever made a decision under pressure that quietly calcified into a permanent habit, long after the original reasoning behind it had stopped making sense, I want you to know, this story understands you completely. Tell me below if you've ever caught yourself doing exactly what Andrew described, protecting someone from something that, if you're honest with yourself, they actually outgrew the need for protection from years ago. I have a feeling this is one of the most common, least discussed patterns in family life, and I think it deserves far more conversation than it usually gets. What followed in our conversation that Sunday was in many ways harder for me to hear than anything Margaret had told me on her balcony, not because the information itself was more shocking, but because it involved my own son's interior life across 4 decades, an interior life I had genuinely believed I understood completely and now realized I had only ever seen a carefully curated portion of. He told me about restructuring the arrangement in the early 1990s, when changes to tax legislation threatened to expose Margaret to liabilities neither she nor Desmond had ever anticipated, and how he'd spent entire weekends, ones I remembered simply as Andrew's busy again with work, quietly protecting 2 people he loved from a danger they didn't fully understand existed. He told me about a particularly difficult stretch in the early 2000s, around the time of his own divorce from Hannah's mother, when Desmond, going through his own private health difficulties at the time, had leaned on Andrew not just for financial advice, but for genuine emotional support Andrew had given freely even while his own life was quietly falling apart in ways he'd never once mentioned to me. Because, as he put it, you were already worried enough about the divorce. Mum, I didn't think you needed Uncle Desmond's health on top of it. I sat with that sentence for a long moment because I recognized, with a clarity that genuinely unsettled me, the exact shape of a pattern repeating itself across an entire family, generation after generation, decade after decade. Protect Eleanor. Don't tell Eleanor. Eleanor's already carrying enough. Andrew, I said, finally, and I want to share with you exactly what I told him, because I think it might matter to some of you listening tonight who have perhaps built your own family role around being the person everyone else decides needs protecting from the truth. I have spent my entire adult life being the person this family comes to when something needs sorting out. Do you understand what it feels like, at 78 years old, to discover that the same family quietly decided, decades ago, that I was too fragile to be told things, while simultaneously trusting me to be the strong one whenever it suited everyone else? He didn't answer immediately. I watched something move across his face that I recognized, with an ache that surprised me as genuine grief, The grief of realizing you've caused harm through an instinct you genuinely believed was love the entire time. I think, he said eventually, very quietly, that we built an entire family around protecting each other from things, and somewhere along the way, we forgot to ask any of the people we were protecting whether they actually wanted that protection, or whether they would have preferred to simply be trusted instead. If that sentence landed for you the way it landed for me, sitting at my own kitchen table, I want you to sit with it for just a moment before you keep watching. There is a profound difference between protecting someone and trusting someone, and I think most families, mine very much included, default to the first one far more often than they realize, simply because it feels safer in the moment, even when it costs something much larger over time. Tell me in the comments, honestly, which one your own family tends to default to. I have a feeling the answer might surprise some of you. It was at this point in our conversation, nearly 2 hours in, the tea long gone cold between us, that Andrew told me the piece of this story that finally connected everything Hannah had spent 3 years quietly investigating, the piece that explained why my own granddaughter had chosen, of every single person in this family, to be the one who finally broke the silence. Hannah, he told me, had come to him directly, almost exactly 3 years earlier, the very week she'd first discovered the property deed at our cousin's house. She had not gone to him as a granddaughter going to her father with a simple question. She had gone to him, deliberately, as someone documenting a story, the very same instinct, he pointed out gently, that had eventually shaped her entire career, the instinct to find the hidden true shape inside scattered, fragmented pieces. She had asked him directly whether the rumors she'd half overheard growing up about Desmond's difficult patch and Margaret's quiet, unexplained generosity were connected, and Andrew, faced with his own adult daughter, asking him a direct question rooted in genuine concern rather than idle curiosity, had made a choice that he told me. Sitting across from me that Sunday, he had spent 3 years quietly regretting. He had told her everything, all of it. The full 40 years of carefully managed family architecture that he had never once shared with me. And then, he said, looking at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, he had asked her, his own daughter, to do something he should never have asked of anyone, let alone someone he loved as much as he loved her. He had asked her to keep it from me, too. I'm going to pause the story right here, on purpose, because I think you deserve a moment to feel the full weight of that the way I felt it, sitting at my own kitchen table across from my son. 3 years. Hannah had carried this not because she chose secrecy out of her own instincts, but because her own father, the same father who had spent decades protecting me from difficult truths out of what he genuinely believed was love, had asked her to extend that exact same pattern into yet another generation. If you've ever realized that a family pattern you thought belonged to one generation has quietly, almost invisibly, been passed down into the next one without anyone consciously deciding to pass it along, I want to hear about it in the comments below, because I think this might be one of the most important things this story has to offer anyone watching it. And if you've made it this deep into our time together tonight, truly, thank you. Hit that like button for me and make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next, the conversation I had with Hannah herself, just 2 days after this one with her father, the conversation where I finally learned exactly why, after 3 years of silence, she chose that particular Sunday at my front door to finally break it, is the conversation that I believe ties this entire story together in a way none of us, including me, fully saw coming. Andrew left my house that afternoon close to 4 o'clock, and we stood together at my door for a long moment before he left, neither of us quite ready to step back into the ordinary rhythm of being mother and son after 3 hours of being something rawer and more honest than that. He hugged me the way Hannah had hugged me exactly 1 week earlier, holding on slightly longer than usual, and I understood, standing there in my own doorway, that I was witnessing the same gesture passed down through 2 generations, the wordless physical apology of someone finally setting down a weight they'd carried alone for far too long. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly into my shoulder. I genuinely thought I was protecting you. I think I've thought that for almost 40 years. I don't know how to feel, knowing now that I might have just been keeping you out." I held on to him for a moment longer before I answered, because I wanted to be certain that what I said next came from somewhere true rather than from the easy comfort of simply reassuring him. "You weren't keeping me out because you didn't love me enough, Andrew," I told him finally. "You were keeping me out because somewhere along the way, this whole family decided that love and protection were the same thing, and nobody ever stopped long enough to ask whether they actually were." He left, and I stood in my doorway for a long time after his car had disappeared down Church Street, watching the late afternoon light do its slow gold fade over the rooftops toward the harbor. The very same light, I realized, that had been falling exactly this way the Sunday before, when Hannah had pressed that envelope into my handbag and asked me not to open it until I was alone. I went back inside, made myself a fresh cup of tea, and sat once more in the good chair in my sunroom, and I found myself thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that this story was no longer simply about an old property deed or a forgotten financial arrangement from 1987. It had become, somewhere across these last 7 days, a story about an entire family slowly, carefully, painfully learning the difference between protecting the people you love and actually trusting them. And I knew, sitting there as the light finally faded fully into evening, that there was still one conversation left that I had not yet had, the one that mattered perhaps more than any of the others, the one with my granddaughter herself, the one who had started all of this with nothing more than a whispered sentence at my front door. If you've stayed with me this far, through Margaret's balcony and Andrew's confession and everything in between, I want you to know how grateful I am for your patience, because I have a feeling, more than at any other point so far in this story, that what Hannah finally told me 2 days later is going to be the part of this entire journey that stays with you the longest. Subscribe now if you haven't. Share this with someone who'd appreciate a slow, honest unraveling exactly like this one, and I'll see you very soon for the next part of this story, where everything Hannah carried alone for 3 years finally comes fully into the light. I drove to see Hannah on the Tuesday, 2 days after that long, difficult, necessary conversation with her father. And before I tell you what she said to me that afternoon, I want to take a moment to thank every single one of you who has stayed with this story through 4 long parts now. That is no small commitment of your time, and I notice it, I genuinely do. If you are joining us only now, at the very end, I would gently encourage you to go back and begin at the beginning, because I think this final piece will mean far more to you with the full weight of everything that came before it sitting properly in your chest. And if you have been here since that very first Sunday afternoon, since the envelope and the whispered sentence at my front door, then I want you to know that what follows is, in many ways, written as much for you as it is simply a record of what happened to me. Hannah opened her door looking like a woman who had not slept particularly well, and I understood immediately, the moment I saw her face, that she had spent the previous 2 days bracing herself for exactly this visit. She made us tea without either of us discussing whether tea was wanted, the way families do when ritual becomes easier than conversation, and we sat together on her small balcony, not unlike the one I had sat on with Margaret the week before, except this balcony looked out over rooftops rather than water, and the silence between us, at first, had a different texture entirely. Margaret's silence had been the silence of relief finally arriving. Hannah's silence was something closer to fear. "Dad called me," she said finally, before I had even managed to find the right opening sentence myself. "He told me what he told you, about asking me to keep it from you too." She wrapped both hands around her cup, the way she used to as a little girl on cold mornings in my own kitchen, and I felt my chest tighten with a tenderness that had nothing at all to do with anger. "I want you to know, Nana, that agreeing to that was the worst decision I have ever made in my entire life. And I made it because I loved you both so much that I genuinely could not see any other way through it at the time. If you have ever found yourself trapped between 2 people you love, each one asking something of you that directly contradicts what the other one deserves from you, I want you to know that this story understands exactly how impossible that particular trap feels from the inside. Tell me below if you have ever been caught in something like that yourself, caught between loyalty to one person and honesty toward another, because I have come to believe, across this entire journey, that this exact bind sits quietly at the center of more family pain than almost anything else we ever talk about openly. And if this story has moved you even slightly so far, I would be so grateful if you would take just a moment to leave it a like right now, because it genuinely helps more people find their way to a story like this one. And I have a feeling there are people out there tonight who need exactly this. What Hannah told me next, sitting on that small balcony with the city spread out gray and quiet beyond the railing, was the piece of this entire story I had been waiting for without quite knowing I was waiting for it. I asked her, as gently as I knew how, why that particular Sunday. Why, after 3 years of careful, patient, lonely investigation, had she finally chosen that exact afternoon, that exact embrace at my front door, to finally hand everything over? She was quiet for a long moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands the way her father had turned his at my kitchen table 2 days earlier. And then she told me about a phone call she had received from Margaret's retirement village only the week before, a routine call simply confirming some paperwork ahead of Margaret's upcoming birthday. A call that had mentioned, almost in passing, that Margaret had recently had what the staff gently described as a small concerning episode. A brief moment of confusion that had resolved itself within the hour, but had left the staff recommending, purely as a precaution, that the family begin thinking ahead about future care arrangements. I sat with that phone call for 2 days, Hannah said quietly, and I realized that if anything ever actually happened to Aunt Margaret, properly happened, the kind of happening you cannot undo, this entire history would have gone into the ground with her. 40 years of her own generosity, completely unacknowledged, because everyone who knew about it had decided, individually, separately, across decades, that telling the truth was somehow more dangerous than simply letting it disappear. I could not let that happen, Nana. I could not let her entire sacrifice simply vanish because the rest of us were too afraid to have one honest conversation. I felt my eyes fill, sitting there on that balcony, in a way I had not allowed myself across this entire journey until that precise moment. Because what Hannah had just described to me was not, in the end, a story about money or property or old legal arrangements drafted in 1987. It was a story about a young woman who had looked clearly at the shape of her own family's fear and had decided finally that someone needed to choose truth over comfort before it became too late to choose anything at all. If that idea has settled into your chest the way it settled into mine, I want you to sit with it for a moment before we continue. There is, I think, a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with confrontation and everything to do with simply refusing to let an important truth disappear quietly, unspoken, into the silence of time passing. Comment below if you have ever felt that specific pull yourself, the sense that something true needed to be said before the chance to say it closed forever. I have a feeling many of you have felt exactly that, perhaps about someone you have already lost, perhaps about someone you still have time left with. Hannah and I talked for nearly 2 hours on that balcony, and what emerged from that conversation, slowly, carefully, was a plan neither of us had fully articulated before that afternoon, but which both of us, by the end of it, understood needed to happen. We decided that the entire family needed to sit together, properly, in one room, and finally say out loud everything that had been managed quietly and separately for nearly 4 decades. Not as an ambush, not as an accusation, simply as an ending, the deliberate, chosen ending of an architecture of silence that had clearly, by every measure, outlived whatever protective purpose it had once genuinely served. We held that gathering on a Sunday, exactly 2 weeks after the very first Sunday that had set this entire story into motion, in my own living room, in the same house that has held 3 generations of this family's quiet history within its walls. Margaret came, moving carefully but determined, refusing any suggestion that the journey might be too much for her. Desmond came, 76 years old now, and visibly nervous in a way I had genuinely never seen from him in my entire life. A man who had spent decades quietly carrying a debt of gratitude he had never once been permitted to express openly. Andrew came, and Hannah, and even my younger granddaughter Olivia, who had known nothing at all of any of this until that very afternoon, and sat through most of it with an expression of careful, growing understanding on her face that reminded me powerfully of her own mother at that age. If you are still with me, here at the very edge of this story's ending, I want to thank you properly, because I know this has been a long, patient journey, and patience like yours is rarer than this world generally acknowledges. Before I tell you what happened in that room, I would ask you gently to subscribe if you have not already, because there will be more stories told from this same chair, in this same sunroom, in the weeks ahead, and I would love for you to be here for them. And if there is anyone in your own life who has ever carried a silence they were too frightened to finally set down, I would ask you to consider sending this story to them tonight. Sometimes the smallest nudge from someone who loves us is exactly what finally gives us permission to speak. I will tell you honestly that I had expected, walking into that Sunday gathering, that there would be tears, and there were, though gentler and far less dramatic than I had braced myself for. What I had not expected, what genuinely surprised me across that entire long afternoon, was how much of what unfolded in my living room was not confession, but simply, finally, gratitude, spoken out loud after decades of being felt privately and never once properly voiced. Desmond spoke first, his voice unsteady in a way that none of us had ever heard from him, a man who had built an entire adult identity around appearing competent and unshaken, regardless of whatever storm might be moving beneath the surface. He turned to Margaret, sitting beside him on my old sofa, and he said simply, "I have owed you an apology for 37 years, and I think the reason I never gave it to you properly is that I was always more afraid of how much I owed you than I ever let myself admit, even to myself." Margaret reached over and took his hand, and she said something I have thought about often since, something I believe carries far more weight than almost anything else spoken in that room that afternoon. "I never wanted an apology, Desmond," she told him. "I only ever wanted to know that what I did mattered to someone besides me. For 37 years, I have known privately that I saved my brother's life. I never once needed anyone else to acknowledge it. But I will tell you honestly, now that you finally have, it feels different than I expected. Lighter. Like I have been allowed finally to simply be proud of myself out loud, instead of only quietly, alone, where nobody else could see it." If that sentence has settled into your own chest the way it settled into mine, sitting in my own living room that afternoon, I want you to know exactly why I am sharing it with you tonight. There is a particular ache that comes from doing something genuinely generous and never once being allowed the simple human pleasure of having it witnessed, openly, by the people it most affected. I believe, having lived through this entire story now, that one of the deepest kindnesses we can offer the people we love is not protection from difficult truths, but the simple, ordinary courage to witness each other fully, including the parts of our history that are difficult, complicated, or layered with old fear. Andrew spoke next, and what he said to me, in front of the entire family, in that quiet living room, with the afternoon light doing its familiar gold fade across the floorboards, is something I will carry with me for whatever years remain to me. He turned to me directly, in front of his sister, his aunt, his uncle, his own daughters, and he said, "Mom, I think I spent 40 years protecting you from things, and I am only now understanding that what you actually needed this entire time was simply to be trusted enough to carry the truth alongside the rest of us. I am sorry it took an envelope in your handbag to teach me that. I should have learned it on my own a very long time ago." I want to pause here before we step into the final piece of this story together, because I think this particular lesson deserves a moment of its own, separate from everything that surrounds it. So many of us, in families exactly like mine, build entire systems of love around the careful management of who gets to know what and when and how much. We tell ourselves we are protecting the people we love from unnecessary pain. And sometimes, genuinely we are. But I have come to believe, sitting in that living room and watching 4 decades of careful silence finally dissolve into something far more honest, that protection and trust are not actually the same gesture, no matter how similar they might feel from the inside while we are performing them. Protection decides, on someone else's behalf, what they are capable of carrying. Trust simply hands them the truth and stands beside them while they carry it themselves. I believe now, with the full weight of 78 years of living behind me, that trust is almost always the deeper kindness, even when it is considerably harder to offer in the moment. If that distinction has meant something to you tonight, I would ask you to comment the single word that best describes how it makes you feel. Just one word, because I read every single one of them, and I want to know exactly how this particular truth is landing across all of you watching tonight from wherever you are. And if you have not yet liked this video, I would be deeply grateful if you would do that right now. Because stories like this one only continue to find the people who need them when enough of you decide they are worth carrying forward. There is one more piece of that Sunday afternoon I want to tell you about, because I think it carries the story's true ending inside it, even more than anything spoken aloud in that room. Near the very end of our long conversation, once the tears had mostly settled and the tea had gone cold in everyone's cups exactly the way mine had gone cold in my sunroom that first Sunday evening, I quietly went to my hallway, retrieved my handbag from its usual hook by the door, and I returned to the living room holding the original envelope, empty now, the one Hannah had slipped into my bag 3 weeks earlier, with that whispered, careful sentence I will never forget for as long as I live. I held it up for the whole family to see, and I told them, simply, that I had decided to keep it, not because of anything it had once contained, but because of everything it had ultimately set into motion. I told them that for 3 weeks I had thought of this envelope as the vessel for a difficult truth, a piece of evidence, almost, in the quiet investigation I had carried out across that strange, illuminating month. But sitting in my own living room, surrounded by every single person this story had touched, I understood, finally, that the envelope had never actually carried evidence against anyone at all. It had carried courage. Specifically, it had carried the particular courage that none of the rest of us, across 4 decades of careful, well-intentioned silence, had ever quite managed to find on our own. My granddaughter, at 31 years old, the very same age her great-aunt had been when she made her own quiet, generous sacrifice in 1987, had found within herself the one thing this entire family had been missing for nearly 40 years, the simple willingness to finally tell the truth out loud, regardless of how frightening that truth felt to carry. If you have made it this far with me, through every part of this long, slow, honest story, I want to thank you properly, from somewhere genuine, because stories like this one only continue, because people like you choose to stay with them all the way to their ending. I would ask you now, gently, to subscribe if you have not already done so, because there are more stories waiting to be told from this same chair, and I would be honored to have you here for them. I would ask you to share this particular story with anyone in your own life who might recognize even a small piece of themselves inside it. Anyone who has ever carried a silence out of love. Anyone who has ever protected someone so thoroughly that protection slowly, quietly, became its own kind of distance. It has been several months now since that Sunday gathering in my living room, and I want to tell you, before I close this story properly, exactly where each of us has landed since. Margaret remains in her retirement village, though she visits far more often now. And last month, at her own insistence, the entire family gathered to formally celebrate, for the very first time in 37 years, the quiet act of generosity that had shaped so much of our shared history without any of us properly understanding it until now. Desmond has begun, slowly and somewhat awkwardly in the way of a man unused to expressing gratitude aloud, the long overdue process of simply thanking the people who helped carry him through his hardest year, including, eventually, a card to Andrew that Andrew told me, with tears in his own eyes, was the first piece of genuine emotional acknowledgement his uncle had ever given him in nearly 40 years of quiet, professional, and personal support. Andrew and I speak now in a way we never quite managed before, with a particular new honesty between us that took considerable practice to build but has become, in these past months, the most valuable change this entire story produced. He no longer decides, quietly and on his own, what I am capable of carrying. He simply tells me and trusts me to carry it the way I have always, somehow, found a way to carry everything else across 78 years of living. And Hannah, my brave, careful, documentary-minded granddaughter, has begun work, with the blessing of every single person involved, on something she has not yet fully described to me, but which I suspect, knowing her as I do, will eventually become her own quiet way of properly honoring this entire family's complicated, generous, imperfect history. The very same instinct that led her, 3 years ago, to begin gathering pieces of a story nobody else had been brave enough to assemble. I want to leave you, tonight, with the thought that has settled most deeply into my own heart across this entire long journey, because I believe it is the truest thing I have learned at 78 years old. And I believe, more than almost anything else I could tell you, that it deserves to travel further than just this living room, further than just this family, out into whatever homes and hearts this story eventually finds its way into. We so often believe that love means protecting the people closest to us from difficult truths, carrying their burdens quietly so they never have to feel the full weight of them. And there is real tenderness in that instinct, real generosity, the kind my own sister demonstrated so completely in 1987, the kind my own son demonstrated, however imperfectly, across nearly 40 years of quiet management and careful silence. But I have come to believe, having lived through this entire story now from its very first whispered sentence at my own front door, that the deepest, truest form of love is not protection at all. It is trust. It is the simple, frightening, ultimately liberating decision to hand someone the whole truth, exactly as it is, and to trust them enough to know they can carry it, exactly the way you have always trusted them to carry everything else you have ever asked of them across a lifetime of loving each other. If this story has given you even a small piece of that understanding tonight, I would ask you, with real gratitude, to like this video, to comment below with whatever truth or memory it has stirred loose in you, and to share it with someone in your own life who might need exactly this particular reminder today. Subscribe if you have not already, because I have many more stories left to tell from this chair by my window, and I would be honored beyond words to have you here for each one of them. Thank you truly, from the bottom of an old woman's heart, for spending this time with me and with my family. Take good care of the people you love tonight, and remember, more than anything else this story has tried to teach you, that the kindest thing you can ever offer someone is not the careful management of what they're allowed to know. It is simply, quietly, the trust to let them know everything, and to stand beside them while they carry it.